So I finally got to play the infamous Ninja Gaiden series, the games that are so difficult that everyone wants to throw their controller out the window and never see it ever again. Well, I figured I would go ahead and give you guys my thoughts on the Ninja Gaiden Master Collection. Initially, I was just playing them for fun, but then I ended up playing them for far too long, and therefore I figured, why the hell not, let's make a video. Now, I don't intend to put a huge amount of effort into the editing of this video, but I'll probably still end up making one of those trailer sequences, so let's just go ahead and cue that off now. I'm Rakamdar, and this is the Ninja Gaiden Master Collection. So for the majority of this discussion, I'm going to focus on Ninja Gaiden Sigma 1 and 2. While I did play a little bit of Razor's Edge during the course of this review, it ultimately wasn't as enjoyable as the first two titles. The slight improvements to Ryu's control and maneuverability were greatly appreciated, but overall I just didn't click with the combat as much. However, for the first two games, this is not the case, and I greatly enjoyed my experience with the two. For those that might be unfamiliar with the series, Ninja Gaiden is an action-adventure game that gives you control over Ryu Hayabusa, a badass ninja out to save the world from bad guys doing bad guy things. It pretty much feels like a B-movie plot that only exists for the sake of putting us in as many insane over-the-top situations as they possibly can. And I, for one, am all about that. The games are notorious for their difficulty, and honestly was the main reason that I wanted to pick up the Master Collection, because I was really curious if that reputation was really true or over-exaggerated. After spending a little bit of time with it, I can honestly say it's a little bit of both. There's a really solid foundation for this game's combat systems, but unfortunately it is plagued by a few design issues that bring it down a bit. However, this core is really well fleshed out, and honestly why I think the game still retains its cult following even to this day. Whenever you think of action games, you can usually kind of spot a core identity for each one. When I think of Devil May Cry, usually over-the-top aerial stylish combos is what I think of, and when I think of something like God of War, it's usually large amounts of mobs that you clear with area of effect abilities. At least with the early God of War games. They obviously shook that combat system up when they started the new series. While the combat does occasionally depart from this core identity, for the most part this is what you can kind of picture when you think about those two games, and that, at least for me, that's what I think of when I hear them. The core identity for Ninja Gaiden is a lot more methodical in its design. Unlike Kratos or Dante, Ryu can't go headfirst into most combat situations, and instead must rely on his heightened agility to pick apart an enemy formation and kill them off one by one. While the games do contain some stylish combos, for the most part this is where I spot the identity of Ninja Gaiden and what separates it from other action titles. The later entries kinda start to lose this identity, almost entirely by Ninja Gaiden 3, where it kinda feels like almost any generic action game. Obviously, some of the remnants of Ninja Gaiden are still there, but you can kind of replace Ryu with any generic ninja and it really wouldn't lose anything. I think, to me at least, this is kinda where the third game begins to lack when compared to the first two in the series. Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2 has a lot more over-the-top action, but it still kind of retains a little bit of that identity, with the first game in the series obviously containing the most out of that core identity. Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2 still allows you to pick apart enemy formations, but there's a lot of scenarios where you're stuck in an arena that doesn't even have a wall to run up, and are forced to just kind of rely on more generic action combo type stuff. Ryu also gains access to more area of effect weaponry such as the Kasuragama and the Lunar Staff that allows him to feel a little bit closer to Kratos when dealing with larger amounts of enemies. However, while it did kind of lose a little bit of that core, Sigma 2 still retains enough of it and feels unique enough to the Ninja Gaiden series that it's a really fun experience to play with. There's actually somewhat of a divide with the community on which one they prefer. Some prefer the more action stylish of Sigma 2, and some prefer the more methodical nature of Sigma 1. Myself, I'm part of the Sigma 1 gang. I really enjoyed the first game quite a lot, and unfortunately the second game took too much away for me to prefer it over the first when it came to things not just related to combat, but also with the overall adventure experience. With the combat specifically, I still feel like Ninja Gaiden 1 truly captures that feeling of what it means to be a ninja. You're constantly placed in scenarios that allow you to take advantage of the terrain and your overall agility to get a leg up on your opponents. A really good portion of the level design places Ryu in locations that allow him to get the most effectiveness out of his mobility. He can roll, jump, run along walls, jump off of walls, and even do a quick Goomba stomp on an enemy's head in order to get that crucial opening for the kill. While you can do a really flashy and stylish combo on that single enemy in order to execute the kill, for the most part this is the core combat loop. The first game is also really careful to not overwhelm the player with too many enemies. Enemy formations rarely go beyond 4 or 5, allowing you to still focus on this 1-by-1 strategy. And if you're someone who likes one of the other weapons in the game, some of those are also capable of more area damage, so you could still find a way to kind of kill off multiple enemies at the same time if you're positioning well enough. While I've painted a pretty solid picture for the first title here, unfortunately it's not so clean. I mentioned earlier that there are some design flaws that kind of hinder a bit of this experience. One of those has got to be the god-awful piece of crap trash tier camera. You've heard of bad PlayStation 2 era camera controls? Well, Ninja Gaiden says I'm gonna go even further beyond. Ninja Gaiden's camera has got to be the single worst camera I have ever dealt with in a single video game. Thankfully, the second game kind of remedies this a little bit, but even then, it is still pretty bad in Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2. The first game, though, is where it is the absolute worst, and I really wish that this was something that could be updated, because if they fix the camera, a lot of the other issues that I have with the game might actually get remedied as well. There's a lot of situations where this 1-by-1 execute strategy that I praise so much is really difficult because the camera just doesn't let you see anything. It's honestly really dumb and probably the worst aspect of Ninja Gaiden 1. Now I'd love to sit here and tell you guys that the camera was easily the worst part and the rest of the game is fine, but unfortunately there's still some glaring issues that I can't pass up. The first one is with the grabs in this game. Holy moly, are they absolutely insane. The grabs are really disgusting and honestly a really frustrating aspect of dealing with some of the enemies in this game, and is especially frustrating when it came to a lot of the bosses for me. Grab attacks would rarely have their own clear visual telegraphed and would often blend in with the rest of the animations that the enemies were performing. Toss in the fact that a lot of the enemies can even hit confirm into a grab, and you just have a really frustrating system that can punish you seemingly unfairly. Additionally, some of the enemies will kind of read your input. I've had several situations where an enemy guard will run at me, so I kind of instinctively hold the block button, and as soon as I hit the block button, bam, they go in for a grab instead. This did admittedly lead to a lot of early frustrations, but after a while you kinda get the hang of Ryu's mobility and you understand that Ryu does not want to be in the same place for very long. However, this is where the janky camera controls can really be super weird when it comes to trying to pull this off. If you're focusing in on an enemy and you don't notice that someone's coming up for a grab or something to attack you with, your best bet is to hold block, and then you have to hope that they don't choose to grab. Additionally, Ryu's auto-targeting can kind of pose some issues here. Usually you want to kind of keep enemies at bay, but because Ryu might occasionally target the wrong enemy for you, and there's no lock-on feature, well, you're just kind of in a bad spot. Devil May Cry and the early God of War games don't necessarily need the lock-on feature because Dante and Kratos swing so wildly and in usually a great area, but when it comes to Ninja Gaiden, like I mentioned, there's a lot of one-on-one type combat, and so you probably should be locking onto certain enemies that you want to focus down in order to kill them off and then move on to the next. And there was definitely several times where I wanted to throw some shurikens at an enemy in the background to kind of stun him a bit so that he wouldn't shoot me, and then Ryu would just kind of throw them to the ground and shoot someone that I didn't need them to, so there could be a lot of frustrating moments with the fact that there's no lock-on. This is especially true when the game decides to pitch you up against fucking helicopters and tanks, and you have to kind of sit there awkwardly in a first-person mode because Ryu's auto-targeting is god-awful. Now, this particular state here is something that does get a little bit fixed with better cameras. Playing through the second game that had a much smoother camera control, even though it's still pretty trash, I was able to find myself targeting things a lot easier. But it's still kind of a band-aid solution. There should totally be a specific lock-on feature so that you can target certain enemies. And finally, one of the last issues I have with the game is, well, the bosses, they're kind of fucking trash. There's only a small select handful of fights that were actually memorable, and most of the time it was not because they were a fun thing to fight, and more so because of the crazy over-the-top nature, like the Statue of Liberty in the second game, or because they were miserable to fight overall, kinda like the electric worm bosses in the first game. Now, that's not to say that the boss fights can't be super easy or really simple once you understood their patterns, but honestly, I just never really enjoyed them. They were uninteresting and didn't really engage me like I wanted them to. There were a couple of fights that I did enjoy. The Doku fight in Ninja Gaiden 1 was pretty solid, and the Red and Blue Tengu fight in Ninja Gaiden 2 was probably one of my favorites overall. But so far, that's 2 out of the 30 or so boss fights, so yeah, that's not a good track record. I could sit here for a while and go on about the specific details as to why I wasn't a fan of most of these fights, but long story short, I didn't think they played into the core identity of the combat like I really felt they should have. Basically, pretty much throughout the entirety of both games, I enjoyed playing throughout the level so much more than I did entering a boss fight. And this includes playing the games on the harder difficulties. In Sigma 2, I started the game on very hard because I had some prior experience with Sigma 1 already, and so I felt like that was something that I was capable of doing. While at first I did struggle a little bit, I had a blast trying to overcome the extra challenge that was the harder enemies in those first few levels. And then I got to one of the major bosses, Genshin, and well, it didn't go very well. Unlike other difficult games where I've spent countless hours grinding a boss fight to understand it and overcome it, Genshin just kind of frustrated me. Ultimately, I just ended up putting the game back on hard mode and continuing on from there. In the first game, they take this a step further because the harder difficulties, well, now the boss fights have ads in them. Honestly, this has got to be one of the laziest attempts to make a boss fight even harder. While, of course, it does succeed in making everything harder, it also makes it even less fun, and pretty much the main reason why I haven't pursued the stuff on higher difficulties. Now I know there's been a lot of crapping on Ninja Gaiden here in these past few sections, but I honestly do this out of love. I'm critical because I care. I genuinely believe that there's a ton of potential here for a phenomenal game. Pointing out the flaws is a crucial step in elevating this series to the next level. As I go ahead and wrap up the video, there is an aspect of Ninja Gaiden 1 that I really liked and want to talk about a bit. Let's go ahead and talk about Ninja Gaiden and how it puts the adventure in action-adventure. Unfortunately, this is a trait a little bit more specific to Ninja Gaiden 1, as the series progresses, they start to take away from this. Honestly, this is the trait that really elevates Ninja Gaiden 1 above the second game for me, because, well, if the second game had this too, it would probably be my favorite of the series. You see, in Ninja Gaiden 1, once you get to a certain point in the game, it opens itself up to a very large interconnected world. While the game is still sectioned off by chapters, you can actually still go back to some of the areas from the previous chapters due to this interconnectivity. This is very reminiscent to early Dark Souls 1, where the entire sections kind of loop back in on Firelink Shrine. You might even spot some light Metroidvania elements, as there will be some obstacles that you can't overcome until you get certain items later in the game. Unfortunately, this interconnectivity no longer exists in Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2, and the exploration becomes a lot weaker because of it. Now, there are occasionally hidden collectibles sprinkled throughout, but for the most part, you're just kind of running from section to section looking for the next battle. This exploration is even more absent in Ninja Gaiden 3, as most of it is pretty much just looking around and hoping you didn't miss one of the collectibles lying on the ground. I would love to see a return to this sense of adventure in a future Ninja Gaiden game. Bring back the equipment and expand upon it in order to provide a satisfying reward for engaging in exploration. Imagine some crazy challenge where you can do all kinds of ninja flippy awesome movement to find a hidden chest and get a badass weapon or armor piece from it. There's a lot of really cool ideas from the core identity of the first game that I think that they could expand upon to make something truly fantastic. I'm honestly really excited to see what kind of ideas that the new team can bring to the table. There's so much potential with this series. In terms of what we currently have though, I still think this collection is worth playing and would definitely recommend them if you're seeking out an action title to sink your teeth into. Now, I'm not quite confident I would recommend them at full price. They are flawed games and certainly not for everyone, but if you spot them on a sale, or maybe you're desperate for a good action game, I would say that they're probably worth it. The first two games has given me a good 30 to 40 hours of playtime, and overall that's been pretty solid. But anyway, I think it's time to stop rambling on here and wrap up the video. If you enjoyed, once more I'll remind you to please hit the like button down below. It really helps out the video and I greatly appreciate it. If you're interested in future content from my channel, consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification icon so you'll be notified when my next video goes live. My plans are to finish up my Persona 5 video and to get into Persona 5 Strikers and finish that game. There's a lot of work ahead and a lot of JRPGs on the horizon, so I'm really excited to continue making more content. Without further ado, I'm going to wrap this up here. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Later.